Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra.
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people
Associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked,
and sometimes what didn't,
you will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts
And inspire you to do even greater things.
I'm in conversation with Karthik Viswanathan, the President of Ochyo Inc., a consulting firm that specializes in serving state and local governments around strategy development, technology enablement, and business process optimization. In this first part of the conversation, Karthik shares his career path about starting in IT after college in Mumbai and getting on to working for a research company and then transitioning from research to government. He also talks about the differences between working in the government and working in the private sector and the key points of impact in government projects. We also touch upon the shifting landscape of government technology. And then I asked Karthik about prioritization, how the requests from different departments and programs are taken up, considering the constraints of budget and bandwidth. Listen on. Hi, Karthik. Welcome to the Software People Stories.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
We usually start with a self-introduction of the guest. And if you can tell us how you got into IT and then what has been your career trajectory, we'll take it from there.
Great. So I started in the IT space back right out of college. So my undergrad was in Bombay, and then I had my first job with digital equipment back in the mid-90s. So I was working for a year in Bangalore, and then subsequently when I came over to the US for graduate school, I had an on-campus job of doing a lot of tech support work for one of the departments on campus. So that kind of got me into the groove. And pretty much right after graduate school, ended up joining a research company doing a lot of software research in the telecom space, and continued to be in that space from there on to government work. So I started in state and local government back in 2007, almost accidentally. And then that's pretty much kept me in that space. So right now, what I do is all the confluence of technology with like mission-driven organizations. And by and large, this ends up being state and local governments.
Oh, wonderful. I think there's a lot of variety in terms of what you've done. So let's start in the initial stage when you said you got into R&D and telecom. So right out of school, how was it to get into a research kind of a role?
So I think a graduate school definitely prepared me for that. Part of what tends to be with like most graduate schools here in the US is it's all research based versus just having like subjects being taught. Pretty much every subject or class you go to has like a research component built into it. So that definitely trained me towards like exploring research oriented organizations. And the company I started with at that time, it was called GTE Labs, which doesn't exist anymore. That's morphed into Verizon today. So Verizon had a research wing which used to look at some cutting edge technology, both in terms of the physics behind telecom, as well as looking at software and services associated with telecom. And this, you're talking about the mid-90s when there was a huge boom. This was like right around the dot-com bubble. There was like big networks being built, fiber optic networks all across the country and the world. So there was some big companies at that time, both in Nortel was like one of the big ones in those days, where there was significant amount of research being done. AT&T had its Bell Labs in New Jersey. So the research work we were doing was almost comparable, even though it wasn't in basic sciences like Bell Labs. It was more applied sciences. And that's kind of where like we came into looking at how devices are being monitored, how you can improve quality of service with like traditional telecom services. And this was, again, the early inception of like mobile services, even here in the US. So it was pretty interesting times at that stage. And that's kind of what, so back to your question about uh, transitioning from a research oriented academic environment into a research oriented commercial environment was relatively seamless. The organization itself had a lot of support. We had like a lot of people with PhDs doing research over like multiple decades, and having those kind of mentors within the organization was a huge help to some foundation in terms of how we wanted to progress within our careers.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that there's more of applied research, and obviously in a commercial environment, you need to see how you can monetize something. So how did you understand the needs of the users, or something like mobile that is just coming in, anticipate what may be needed, and then work on something that would be useful for them?
Uh, Great question. So we were lucky enough that even though I was part of a research group, there is a commercial side of the business. This was like a traditional telecom company. So we had a captive audience, almost like an anchor tenant for the work we were doing. So there was a feedback loop of what they perceived, or like they saw the actual need or the latent need from a customer. And then rather than going out and exploring actually the level of commercial options in the early 90s and the mid 90s was much more limited than what you have today. And so we had a feedback mechanism by which they would let us know, okay, here are like some business needs we have, but we don't have a solution in the marketplace today. So that in turn would then like start the wheels in motion of looking at, okay, what kind of research is going on within the labs right now? How could we start looking at those? So this became like an incubation setup for us.
Okay.
In a couple of instances, those became pretty efficient and popular internally. Then our company used to have tie-ups with some of the other international companies, telecom companies. So we would then start looking at commercializing that with maybe trying this as a proof of concept within those international telecom companies. So I'd worked with our partner organizations in like Germany, South America, Canada, and South Africa as well. So looking at those, some were successful in very small pieces, others were failure, but failure is not a true failure, because like those were like learning exercises for us, and like we could take that in and like start building better products as well.
Yeah, some of my friends who were in telecom in the early days also had to do some field work, right from configuring the antennas, and then probably they had to climb poles and do all that. Did you get into any of that kind of excitement?
I did only on paper. So I was part of a group which was like, it's a heavily unionized organization when it comes to field work. So there were a couple of instances when labor negotiations were going on within the company, and there was an imminent chance of like a strike, a potential labor strike. So we were all expected to undergo the training of like how you go into center, like a central office, that's what it's called, and then go in and figure out like how you splice a cable, how do you start climbing up poles, how do you start fixing in like some of the northeast areas, northeast of the US. These are not underground cables, but the cables are all like on poles on the streets. So we had to learn how to get into a bucket truck, how to like uh, do it. So it was all on a training basis, but luckily for me, I never had to do it in real life.
Okay. So from being in a commercial organization in a fairly tech or an emerging tech space, how was the shift to government?
Very interesting. So it was almost accidental for me to get into government. So I had done my business school when I was in the private sector. And then right after that, like I had a small consulting firm, and we were doing some work for a couple of local state agencies. And I almost accidentally came into contact with uh, a mayor of a local town here outside of Boston. And that's how I got to know about an opportunity where they wanted to look at some optimization of IT organizations across like different lines of business within local government. So I almost took this up as a challenge, and I thought like this is something I would do for like a few months
Mhm.
and then get back into my private sector world.
Mhm.
But there were a few incidents that happened that really made me think of like the value add technology can provide in government organizations.
Mhm.
So one particular example, so this was about 6 months into my role as the CIO for this municipality. There was a huge fire in like one of the middle schools in that community. And this community is like a relatively blue collar community. So
Mhm.
not very affluent community. And like a lot of these people are like uh, new immigrants into the community with like
Mhm.
maybe multiple jobs.
Mhm.
But we had just undertaken like a voice over IP initiative
Okay.
about 2, 3 months before that.
Mhm.
So over a weekend, and there were about 600 kids in this particular middle school.
Mhm.
Over a weekend, we were able to transition those kids into like
Mhm.
2 or 3 other middle schools in that municipality
Okay.
almost seamlessly because of technology being like
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
huge component.
Mhm.
That kind of got me thinking to say, yes, I mean, there is a lot of bureaucracy which goes in with typical governments, as
Mhm.
is the case anywhere in the world.
Mhm.
And things tend to be a little slower. But the inherent challenges they deal with in terms of providing better customer service,
Mhm.
how quickly technology can be implemented, what kind of
Mhm.
legacy systems you have, how do you
Mhm.
transition things to modern infrastructure or like technology, are almost the same.
Mhm.
Resources might be a little bit more limited, but that is no different from
Mhm.
a smaller company or a startup,
Mhm.
which kind of deals with the same challenges.
Mhm.
But in terms of the longer term impact a good implementation can have is significantly more with
Mhm.
these kind of government organizations than like smaller entities in the private sector.
Mhm.
And that's kind of got me like increasingly going within that space. So I moved on from municipalities to like doing work for state government.
Mhm.
And then over the last 5 years, again, some opportunities came up. And like what I do now is like interim leadership or like agency head roles
Mhm.
where there is a void or like a need within state and local organizations.
Mhm.
I go in, or like my team goes in and like fills in those voids for those companies or for those government entities.
Yeah, I want to touch upon the term impact that you mentioned, because in the commercial space, we normally talk about ROI, particularly for IT investments, where there could be a direct connect to whether it is the top line or the bottom line, and you may be able to do some correlations. But in the public sector, social space, or government, uh, we talk about impact. But two questions here. Now, one is how do you identify what the impact should be? And impact usually being a lagging indicator, which is going to happen much later. How do you get your funding year on year or maybe project to project?
Great question. So in government, there's also the third factor of a long tail, right? So at private sector, for most part, there is like a certain group of users or set of. So let's take an example, right? So let's say it's a new product that's coming into the marketplace. Maybe they look at impact of those products or like usability of that products. Let's say for like somebody who's physically challenged, visually impaired, or like whatever the case might come in as a secondary thought for the product. So they might like initially launch the product and subsequently look at those markets. But when it comes to government services, that long tail would have to be addressed right from the beginning. So in terms of starting to provide for like any kind of upfront analysis to say, okay, here's what the funding requirements are for a certain project versus what kind of an impact it's going to have, or like there is no ROI from a commercial perspective for most part, right? There are certain areas where government has the ability to charge customers if it's a value added service. But if it's a core service, whether it's public safety, roads, bridges, schools, those don't have those kind of metrics. It's looked at slightly different. So I'll give you one specific example, which is like highly impactful for me when this initial conversation happened. So I was helping out with an unemployment system for a state government. I was having this conversation with the head of the agency when we initially started talking about it. This was like a multi-million dollar project across like 2 or 3 years. So his first reaction when we started talking about numbers was, okay, somebody is going to go file for an unemployment. They are in a very low point in their life right now. They've been like laid off a job. They're trying to go in and like get some interim monetary benefits so they can help put food on the table. The last thing they want to deal with is like a slow system or like a system that doesn't work, right? What kind of a price do you put on that for that individual, right? So that's kind of how we start relating to a lot of these projects. Yes, there needs to be something from an efficiency perspective, how things are being operated. There is also the initial capital funding, which comes in for large projects. But then as you start transitioning into the operational side, how do we make it more efficient within those organizations? That comes into play. But always having the human angle tied into it and like seeing how impactful it's going to be. There's also the fraud, waste, and abuse, which we typically think of from a government perspective to say, okay, there is a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse, but how do we manage that right from the beginning and start looking at those components and plugging those holes has an impact as well. So when we are talking about dollars and cents, we also start talking about the impact on the citizen of a community. That definitely has a very strong impact when we start talking to the right people, whether it's on the finance side or if it's going to be with the decision makers.
That's again, you brought out a very good point about the, let's say, the emotional status of this person, who's applying for a job. So in designing at least public systems, how much of the user-centeredness or understanding the user and empathy for the users, how important is it, and then how do you kind of design for that?
So this, I can give you a chronological history on the user, let's say the user experience side before like coming into designing or selecting products or vendors and government. If you go back even like 20 years ago, pretty much government would build the system they want versus thinking of like what a constituent or like a citizen's experience would be. I think part of the increase in like what is expected from a constituent's perspective, if I can click 2 buttons and like go buy something on Amazon, as a constituent, I'm expecting a very similar response from my government as well. I think that's the fundamental shift we've seen over the last 20, 25 years. So increasingly now, when we look at products, and then I should give you the COVID impact as well, the post-COVID world. I mean, another big shift that happened. So I put it in like 3 phases. The first phase was that change going into the Amazon or like the Google experience. The second shift came in with the cloud migration. So this started happening in the mid 2000s when initially you had a lot of private sector moving into the cloud space, public cloud. And then governments were always saying, okay, our networks are more secure. We can like handle things better than putting it in commercial cloud because we don't know where the data is going to go or what kind of security mechanisms are there. Then we saw very large federal agencies start shifting into that public cloud space. And that was a game changer. So once we started seeing these large federal government public agencies shifting into that space, for local and state governments, it became a much easier sell to their higher ups within the organization to say we can go there. The scale is there, right? So a lot of these companies or the state agencies which shifted to cloud for their big applications, when COVID hit, and all of a sudden like data centers or like manning those data centers became like a big challenge with staff. Being in the public cloud space was a huge boon. And then the third shift that happened was there was a lot of demand on shifting how government provides services during COVID. So traditionally, these used to be like people having to walk up to buildings or like go in and like do things. Now they wanted to transact and do things online. There were a lot of new programs that were put in place by the federal government at that time, back in 2020, in order to provide these services. There was like a new kind of unemployment that was set up, then the case investigation, contact tracing around vaccination. So overnight, you had to have new software systems built. So what traditionally in government used to take 6 months, a year, 2 years to build out systems, now had to be done within a matter of like weeks, if not like within a month or two. So then government started shifting into low code, no code kind of development. And this also from a project management perspective, when you think about it, there's always this constant battle between, do I do like a business process re-engineering first and then go look for the right solution, or do I pick a solution and then change my business processes, right?
Mm.
So this is the age-old challenge or question we've had in government. Government is probably even bigger challenge, where sometimes the business process is just a strongly held belief more than like what is mandated or like what's the law. But COVID completely changed that. So now you could have these low code, no code kind of applications where you don't have to make that decision. If something doesn't work from a business process, those changes can be made in a no code environment within like days. And then like you reiterate that and like come up with a product. And then the deployments can be much faster. So that was the third shift which happened. So today, when you look at any new products or like solutions that's being deployed, government contracts are not talking about like, okay, this needs to be implemented in like 2 years or 3 years. They're saying, okay, this is going to be more of an agile way of doing things. This is how we want it done. And then we want to see like a proof of concept or the MVPs done within like weeks. And that's kind of how the contract pricing is set up as well.
Mm-hmm. So, two questions related to that. Now, one, when you have, let's say, the influence from the federal policies or how they're moving and then influencing this. The second is the talk about MVPs and more agile ways of working. When the government plans usually are spanning maybe 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, how do you kind of convert that into shorter term goals and kind of add up?
So great question again. So I decouple the federal piece from the state and local, because there is a lot more continuity in state and local government in terms of, even if politically the administrations change, in terms of the services they provide and how the policies are governed is slightly different. And again, depending, each country is different in terms of how it's structured. Here, it's more grassroots, where like the local and state have a lot more leverage in terms of deciding on those policies than the feds. Yes, there is a funding component which comes from the feds in certain areas, but those are more from a program perspective and not in terms of any kind of technology or like how things are going to get implemented, right? And even the funding sources, there's like two significant funding sources. One is, as is the case with like larger private sector organizations too, there is the capital funding, which always looks at it from a 4-year, 5-year cycle, and then the operating component, which looks at it from every 12-month cycle. So the projects which are on that 5-year capital cycle, those, and for most governments, there's always exceptions to this, but most governments tend to have those 5-year or like 10-year capital plans, where they lay out how the funding is going to come in, whether it's through bonds at a local or a state level, or if it's going to come through any kind of federal funding, right? So the federal funding component for certain agencies, so by and large in the US, Health and Human Services and Department of Education within the state level have huge chunks of money that are funded through the feds. But then you take other 6 or 7, whether it's public safety, whether it's administration, finance, economic development, those are all largely funded at state and local levels. So the projects would also be tied to one of those two. The other thing CIOs at like state level tend to look at is, what's the level of aggregation they can do for any software solutions they want to implement? So that rather than looking at it from one agency or silo, they look at it since they have visibility into like multiple agencies. They can see if they're going to build like, let's say, a CRM solution, not just look at it as a single agency, but what can I do at an enterprise level? That gives a lot more leverage. There is also an economy of scale to do that. There's a higher funding available. So now a smaller agency, as I mentioned earlier about the long tail, a smaller agency still needs to meet its constituents' demands as a very large agency. But the economy of scale of looking at it from an enterprise perspective gives that smaller agency a voice to come in and like have their needs heard and try to implement that as well. And to the other related question in terms of how the planning is done, so the MVPs can be done for that smaller agency because it's an easier requirements, which can be done. And it also becomes a use case for that larger agency. So if something doesn't work within that, we learn much faster. You'd rather learn earlier, fail, and then like do something better than implement a large project and then figure out like there are like huge gaps or holes within that.
So how does prioritization happen in such cases? This is not just for the government agency. Any CIO usually has to balance the requests from different groups, and the budgets are going to be limited, obviously. In terms of government, it probably becomes a little more complex because the policies of the current dispensation might be, let's say, different from what it was in the previous regime. Then you can't drop a project suddenly because all the investments would then be waste. At the same time, there are newer things that need to be done as well. So as a CIO, how would you manage the stakeholders first and then also prioritize within your team? The answer to that question and many more topics in the next part of our conversation. Don't miss the next episode.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People Stories.
If you like this episode,
please subscribe on your favorite podcast client
and spread the word in your network.
If you'd like to share your story,
contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.